Hello, everybody. Welcome to our podcast, part of the Urban Design Group's Urban series. We thank the Urban Design Group for inviting us to pre-record this for you to listen to at your leisure. We are three individuals who have recently published a book. I'm going to introduce all of us in a little bit, but you'll see our names on the screen there. We're here to talk, yes, about a book that we've recently published called Applied Urban Design, a contextually responsive approach with Routledge. But actually, we really want this podcast to focus more on kind of starting a discussion around urban design as a technical vocation. We have backgrounds in practice, but we also work in higher education at the University of Manchester and the University of Sheffield. Um, and so we're very much interested in teaching urban design and graduating students from urban design programs with the practical skills and the knowledge that they require to make a difference in the physical forces and physical aspects of our cities. And a lot of what this book and what this presentation will talk about is a methodology, a process, if you like, that we call the Applied Urban Design Framework of how they can do that, how they can kind of engage on a practical sense on their day-to-day lives, and how we as educators can actually teach these students the core skills that they will require for these roles. So we want to kind of start a conversation. We would love for people to engage with us via social media, via our emails, which we'll put up on the screen at the end as well. Um, so yeah, we want to talk a little bit about why we design, who we design for, and what we design. I think there are kind of considerations, there are knowledge that are prevalent in urban design education and urban design practice as well. I think we've got a really good handle on urban design as a reasonably young discipline on why we actually do design. We design for social reasons, we design for environmental reasons, we design for economic reasons. We do all of those different things because people need places to work, to live, to play, to socialize. We have lots of different people who live within urban areas, from the very youngest to the very oldest, of different abilities, cultures, and contexts. And actually, why we design is really well researched, really well understood. And we kind of want to add to that, but also equally we understand that it's already an area that's kind of really full and that we want to kind of use and play off as we think about the more practical elements of designing. The who we design for, I think today we see more and more kind of a rejection of globalized design. We're seeing more and more a move away from the homogenization of communities and of peoples within cities and within places. We're seeing more and more studies and research and projects that really value diversity, that really look to provide inclusive, accessible environments, that are pushing agendas around equitable placemaking. And these are really positive things that, again, we want to kind of promote, we want to kind of add our voice to and add our weight to in terms of our own research and our own kind of practice and pedagogy within university settings. And also what we design. I think one of the things that really over the last 20, 30 years plus that we've become much better at, I think, as researchers, as um, practitioners, as those interested in urban spaces and cities, we've become really clued into what we're designing in terms of quality. I think best practice policies around what makes great places, what makes great spaces. The Urban Design Group themselves have been at the forefront of this in the United Kingdom with some fantastic guidance documents and setting out ideas of principles of quality, setting out ideas of great places. This is Baltimore Waterfront, which was in the 80s, 90s, really a great template for future waterfront developments elsewhere. It kind of set agendas around early design codes for this type of development in these types of context. Those things have their own downfalls as well, as we know, where people start to replicate design, where people start to transfer universally good design lessons into contexts that maybe do not suit, that do not work. And that's why I think we want to talk about beyond the why, the who, and the what, we want to consider the how. We want to consider how you develop these designs to ensure that we're designing in the right ways for the right people, for all people, and that we're designing places that, yes, have quality, yes, have kind of lessons that others can take, but are very much of their place, of their communities, of their context. And that's kind of the how and the skills that we want to see students develop, that we want to see graduating urban designers move out into practice to be able to deliver in a real world setting. And to do that, we think we need to talk more about the idea of urban design as a technical vocation. Urban design as a professional, responsible practice beyond the remit of architects, of landscape architects, of planners, with a strong focus on understanding and responding to context. We believe that urban designers must really engage with complexity of context, undertake a process of balancing the needs of people and the demands of place, which often provides much tension, as many of us will know, in the kind of practical world of trying to bring development online. And presently, we would argue there's actually a lack of applied process for practicing this type of context-led urban design. We've seen a lot of urban design education and a lot of urban design practice kind of borrow lots of ideas from other disciplines and borrow lots of processes and methodologies from other fields. And urban design and what we've tried to do is kind of introduce a first contextually responsive approach, which is dedicated to the practice of urban design itself. The first step in seeking out methods and approaches for physically manifesting and testing ideas of what we should design, who we should design for, and why we're doing it. So those are kind of things that we want to talk about, an approach to practice. One's not tied to a particular context or setting, but one that is transferable, not just within a UK and Irish setting, but also internationally that others can kind of tie into, that others can plug into. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about how you can plug other ideas in, other theories, other kind of urban conditions and settings can play off some of the processes that we're going to introduce in this talk today. What responsibility has the urban designer got? That urban designer has the responsibility of delivering the places that people will engage with, the quality of life will be produced and introduced through. And it's an important aspect that we should take seriously as we consider the skills, knowledge, and competencies required to undertake such roles. How can urban designers interact consistently in practice? How can they represent people? How can they be focused on quality? How can they desire and promote and deliver more sustainable solutions that are thinking about local place? To do that, we have developed based on extensive research, teaching, collaboration with practice, our own experience in the field, a process for understanding and practicing applied urban design in a contextually appropriate manner. Our framework, which you can see here, which I won't talk at length about because we're going to kind of break this down through the podcast with my colleagues, but it kind of articulates and sets out what the application of urban design means precisely and provides, importantly, a structure for practice to allow others to fully appreciate the distinct practice of urban design as a field and as a discipline, and how urban designers themselves can champion better placemaking, kind of thinking more carefully about local place and context. It's a structured, but it's a flexible process, and that's an important point that we want to make very early. For design, development, production, and delivery, it combines all of those things. It combines technique, it combines methods with applied practical applications. Whilst you see here, this is a four-step process, very much linear in its kind of arrow format to deliver from kind of process, client, outcome, and place. It's very much a iterative process where what you put in, you get out. You're constantly moving back and forward through a process of reflection, evaluation, and justification for all of your design decision making. We'll also talk a little bit at the end about how this isn't just a process for delivering physical spaces, but it's actually a process that allows you to communicate and present design process, design decisions to a wide range of audiences and actually can feed into the delivery of better placemaking, plan making, and policy making as well. The notion of the urban designer does remain kind of a vague thing in practice and education currently. I don't think that the urban designer is a well-defined term. I think it's used broadly across other disciplines, sometimes seen as a sub-discipline within architecture or planning. And again, the idea of what are the kind of core mandates, core skills and practical applications that are required to call yourself an urban designer are still not set out in any kind of formalized manner. We want to see a clearer vocational consolidation, if you like, of what is an urban designer. What is the territory of action that's directly dealing with these physical forces of the city, that's translating policy and strategy into real world physical solutions and interactions to deliver better places for people? Yes, it's a technical offshoot that we're talking about from the wider field. We're not trying to redefine urban design as a kind of broad field. We see value in kind of that kind of wider thinking, the wider research that goes on within urban design. But we're kind of trying to define and create and carve out a space for practice. We're trying to consider urban design as the genuine fourth design discipline that sits alongside the more traditional cousins of planning, architecture, and landscape design. So to step back just for a second and introduce ourselves, that seems like a strange thing to have kind of done a 10 minute waffle through there. But we are a series of academics and practitioners who came together in Manchester 10 years ago now and started this process of where we've kind of ended up with this publication. It's been tested in Manchester. It's been tested abroad in places like Aalborg University. It's currently being operated out of Sheffield. It's currently being used to train practitioners within the RTPI, within local authorities. It's currently being used to shape and help define design coding and policy with major local authorities in the UK. So it's something that's been well shaped and well tested and well kind of refined, if you like, through that process. My name's Philip Black. I'm the director of the Manchester Urban Design Lab at the University of Manchester. My fellow presenters today are also two of my co-authors, Dr. Michael Martin, who's a lecturer in urban design at the University of Sheffield and also runs their MA program there, and Bob Phillips, who's a director of urban imprint, a RTPI award-winning planning design consultancy in Macclesfield, and also works closely with us at the University of Manchester as an honorary lecturer. Not with us, but also involved within the book publication is Dr. Taki Sombly, who works at the Manchester Urban Design Lab. This is the book. I mean, we don't want to try and oversell you something. We're not here to kind of just market a book and try to get some sales, although it is available at all good book retailers and some not so good ones as well, no doubt. You can find it at the Routledge website or Amazon or anywhere else that you kind of have an interest in. But really, what we're talking about is the idea that the book is kind of shaping our presentation today on this idea of the vocational discipline of urban design. And the structure of the book very much will mimic what we talk about over the next 20 or 30 minutes or so. We've got these three parts that we want to talk about. Really, part A is setting the scene of urban design as an emerging field. The necessity for a fourth discipline somewhere between the planner and the architect that's been kind of around the idea around since the kind of 1950s, 1960s. The idea that urban design is still a very immature, young sibling to the kind of more established disciplines of planning, architecture, and landscape. It's often lacking that kind of clear mandate, agreed area of action that we've just been talking about. We've got this second part where we introduce the urban design framework, and then the final part where we really reflect on some of those ideas and we really think forward about how do we reframe urban design in the light of some of these findings and some of these ideas that we've kind of introduced. So part A, I'm going to kind of introduce part A. I'll pass over to my colleague Bob for part B. Mick will take us through part C, and then I'll close us up with that kind of reframing idea and trying to start new conversations with all of you who are listening, which would be great to hear your input and your thoughts on some of the things that we talk about. The emerging discipline of urban design, I want to kind of talk through three areas that we see as really, really important. I think the first of those, and probably the predominant term that we'll use quite a lot through this presentation and we use quite a lot through our publication is context. The idea of a kind of palimpsest of place, the complexity of context is something we want to really kind of put forward and really put front and center as people kind of try to understand local environments and local people. We want to think about the different scales that exist in places. We want to think about the complexity of development that happens over a period of time, and actually to be able to strip back those layers of history and those layers of time that really help us to unpack what makes a place unique over another place. And that idea again that transferring lessons wholesale from one context to another is not necessarily the most appropriate way to go, and often those kind of designs fail over and over again, and it's because of that kind of complexity. And that's partly because of this generic notion of kind of thinking about places as not unique, as thinking about places in the simple way. Response to per design is really what we're kind of trying to focus on, this response to thinking about a globalized Starbucks type of urbanism where a successful design in one place is brought into a unique context where it just simply doesn't work, challenging the idea that urban design lessons can be lifted and transferred, and seeking out more locally distinct solutions to those environments. But how can we really truly know context? And more critically, how can we shape a contextual design that's not pastiche, that doesn't have replication, that really is thinking about function, quality, and is thinking about forward looking, innovative solutions that are sustainable and are justifiable in terms of their process and in terms of their delivery. And that's really where I think our transferable method is something that we see as very important. This idea of a repeatable, place-to-place transferable approach. The outcomes defined by the site, by the context, a process that's both linear but iterative at the same time, that will shift and mold to the unique conditions. It's not a silver bullet. It requires expertise. It's a framework that's only as good as those using it. A structure for practice. It's the kind of parameters for developing better design. It's illustrating why urban design is a necessary part of building better places for people. It's showcasing and articulating the role of the urban designer. I'll pass over to Bob to walk you through the main parts of this process that we've developed.
Thanks very much, Phil. Um, Welcome everybody. I'm going to try over the next sort of 10-ish minutes to try and give you a bit of a meat of what the book is and what our process is. Um, you, ladies and gentlemen, the majority of you are practicing urban designers, you're teaching, you're working in this field. So what I'm going to talk about actually will feel very familiar. And that's actually really quite intentional from us. We were very clear that this doesn't, we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're trying to look at what is that best practice in terms of process. How do we define that? How do we codify it? And then how can we use that as a process to help practitioners, to help students, to help communities engage with this process, which we call urban design. So for some of you, this will be really useful and helpful in rekindling and reshaping your own practice. It'll help you challenge some of the decisions that you might have been making. But for a lot of you, it might feel like putting on a sort of comfortable overcoat, and that's part of the whole process about it. That it should feel really comfortable, really iterative, and we've worked really hard to try and achieve that. Now, let me just check. Oh, here we go. Thanks very much. The slides move automatically for me. So Phil's shown you this process diagram before. You can see how, broadly speaking, there are three parts to this process: the context stage, the pivot stage, and the design process. I mean, for those of you that are familiar with it, it's almost the discover, define, design, and deliver that we might otherwise see elsewhere in product design or even placemaking, as we've come to talk about it, or regeneration. And that context-driven element, very much analysis based on understanding. Phil's talked about that. Why do we design? Who do we design for? It's about asking some of those who, those whats, those wheres, those hows. It's trying to bring those ideas together. It's trying to organize them in a way that we as urban designers can use them effectively and robustly. The second section, oh, sorry, can we go back a slide? There we go. Sorry about that. That second section, that pivot, we'll talk a little bit about that. That's actually quite unique and something we thought really hard about how we translate this idea of understanding place to making contextually responsive designs, to make sure that the solutions that we're looking at are based in design. And then that final section, that design, there is an awful lot of technical skills and technical competencies. But how do you make design decisions? For those of you that are in practice, sometimes you just make them automatically because your experience, your background, you've seen it before. It's all there and it allows you. But how can we try to define that? How can we share that with others? Because really, we're talking about having a transparent process here as well. And for those that are approaching this for the first time, for students, for young practitioners, how can you get involved in that and how can you show and demonstrate that you're being robust in your process? Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've done throughout the book is shown this live and shown this process being delivered on two live real world case studies. We've chosen one in Manchester and one in Aalborg. One of the reasons for those two choices was broadly practical because that's where we were and that's where we were teaching. And of course, you can't do urban design without going on site and getting right under the skin of a place. And so if we were going to do it properly and robustly, we needed to do that ourselves. But the other thing was that we saw in Manchester and Aalborg two really different contexts. Not only are they different countries, they've got different climates, they've got different architectural histories and different policy mechanisms as well that are going to guide the way in which these schemes might come forward. So the idea was to show two completely different contexts and how this process then would work between the two of them. And that was actually really important for us. And as Phil's already explained, although we've shown the two worked examples here and they sit throughout our book, and we hope that they're really useful in enlightening people as to why we've suggested a process in the way that we've suggested. But we've tested this process elsewhere. We've tested this on sites in Sheffield, in Manchester, in London, in Birmingham. I've been working with the RTPI, training people who've been applying it all over the UK. So actually, this is something that we're now fairly confident is a transferable process. Next slide, please. So this idea of context is really important. That first stage of the process, establishing the context. It's a bit like, and I use the analogy always, of building a car. And essentially the context is the engine. You've got to start to think about what are the bits that are going to drive this car forward. What is it that we're basing everything else around? If you don't have an engine, the car doesn't work. So our whole context is about this idea of context building, building a repository of knowledge about a place, about a project, about a client, about a site that can help us make informed decisions. So if we just go on to the next slide, you'll see one of the diagrams from our book where we're talking about this idea of context. We're talking about it working across multiple scales. So from the strategic scale, which is something I think is really important that we often forget about in urban design, that we're looking at cities, we're looking at sub-regions, we're looking at the role, certainly on bigger sites, on master planning scale, when we're maybe looking at urban extensions. We need to be thinking at that sort of scale, looking at the trends, looking at futures, looking at directions of policy travel. And at that local scale, those physical characteristics, the material considerations, the way that people are actually living and working in that environment. And we look at that for a whole series of different mechanisms, and the book sets these out, looking at single variables, looking at multivariables, grouping these into themes, and finally, the really quite important part about setting a series of profiles. These are set at different scales, but these are these are the conclusions of that context building. So the whole process about what data to collect, how to collect it, how to synthesize it, that's the word there on the left-hand side, bringing it all together to actually make it usable, bringing everything together to what are the core, really important things that we need to know about this site. And when we design for it, that we can hit the buttons on. Next slide. And you can see here, this is an example from Manchester. This is just the thematic group about character. But again, it's not just looking at a character area plan. It's going beyond that. It's getting under the skin. It's looking at the vernacular. It's looking at the built form. It's looking at density. It's starting to try and bring all of those things out, bring those elements together. I think this is a particularly good example of using multiple different variables in multiple different ways, using multiple different techniques. And that's what being an urban designer is all about. It's about using the right tools in the job at the right time to give you a complete and comprehensive picture. Next slide. And here we are again, another one with Manchester. This is the concluding site profile here. So we're bringing together lots of different types of analysis to try and give ourselves a snapshot picture of what are the key issues. One of the things that we do in the book as well is that we give a clear commentary there about why we've chosen certain things. What was that decision-making judgment? One of those really important things about being an urban designer is why have you chosen to showcase what you're showing in a particular way? And actually, hopefully, we're hope that the book is really helpful in illustrating some of that process for you all. But you can see clear diagrams, clear keys, lots of different techniques, cross sections, maps, 2D plans, photographs, drawings. Again, making sure that there is a really wealth of information and different presentation techniques there. That's what makes it really helpful for people to engage with. And that's what we want to do. Next slide. So the idea behind this then is that we're coming to this idea called the pivot. Okay, this idea of linking between the analysis and the design process. And actually, if I look at it in practice and what I've seen as a practicing planner, urban designer, people working in regeneration, often this is done really, really badly. And the idea is that at no point is there any ability to gather together everything that you've got from that context building analysis stage, use that in a certain way, define that, and use that to drive your design process forward. So we talked about how the context being the engine, the pivot is the transmission. Okay, this makes sure that it translates that power that's coming from that context into something that we can start to use. Okay, it's starting to put the power down onto the ground, and you can start to see how we're doing that there. So it's this link between context on the left, design on the right. Okay, it's about bringing opportunities and constraints together. It's about thinking about objectives, as we call them, design actions, which are essentially what can we physically do on a site? What are the physical design interventions that we want to make? It's about thinking about spatial concepts or concept, but together they make a program. This allows us to instill in the real world ideas of community consultation and engagement. It allows us to throw in client briefs and aspirations. It allows us to throw in policy objectives at the local level. All of these things can start to be melted down in a pot against that background of that context that we've already developed. It gives us a checklist that we can go forward. And here you can see again that we're now on the Aalborg site. Interestingly, here in the book, Manchester is pink, Aalborg is blue. So when you see those colours, perhaps you really navigate the book and those worked examples. But you can see there, series of very clear, very simple objectives, quite wide. What are almost our aspirations for this site? We've got a series of design actions there, very site specific, very much about the key aspects of it. And then a spatial concept, and collectively bringing together, forming a design brief, which then allows us to move on to design. And that design process is something that is often taught. But again, part of the process about it is how is it taught in relation to the context, to the pivot? And that's certainly something that we've been thinking about. If we go on to the next slide, it shows different ways that we're thinking about communicating and talking about a final design. So there are the technical components, and we spend a lot of time in the book talking about those technical components. The 12 functional blueprints, what they are, why they work, how you should design for each of them, how you might start to consider them. There are best practice examples of how you can use that, but also how you're using your context to help you make those decisions. Second element is those livable qualities about actually how do we create a place? We are designing places for people. So again, what is it that a designer needs to be thinking about underneath A to J, as it were? Those long-term, short-term, place-based, feel, idea place. What makes an ideal place? But of course, as we've already talked about, there is that real strong aspect of being contextually responsive. So how are we linking this back to our program? And then finally, still back to those scales again. Sometimes when we're designing and we notice it with students, and I remember being a young urban designer, you suddenly get so site focused that you forget the bigger picture. And again, just thinking about the techniques and the processes and the design mechanisms that can help you keep your head out of the detail, as well as making sure that you've been robust and you've tested and you've got something that's deliverable. So let's have a look at two examples again that we've got. Got one from Aalborg and one from Manchester. So here in Manchester, we're looking at those design evolution processes, how you might start to move a what you've got to see in the top left there in terms of a concept into a master plan for the site. How are you analysing and evaluating that against that pivot? Really, really important. And we spend quite a lot of time talking in the book about how you can do that as a practitioner and how the urban designer approaches this process. And then again, to compare that one then with Aalborg, here we go. We're looking very simply here at one aspect of those 12 key elements of it that we were talking about earlier. Looking here at public realm and green infrastructure, about how that's manifesting itself on the site. Again, looking at those two scales there, looking how we've come back out from just the site, looking again at that strategic context. So, and again, then right into the detailed design process here, again on the Allbug site, because we're back on blue, but looking at different techniques that the urban designer can use to communicate their ideas, to communicate their thinking about those livable qualities of a place. And again, they're using 2D plans, using cross sections, using best practice. Again, that variety of techniques to help illustrate to make sure that you're able to effectively communicate. Urban design and good quality urban designers are able to communicate, as you also know well. So that's really, really important that we're exploring and expressing how you might start to do that. So the whole process here comes back to, and the next slide will come in a second, it says the context, the pivot, and the design as three distinct stages working together allows us to move to what we call on the next slide this idea of a transparent process. And transparency is really, really important. And that's allowing us as practitioners, as urban designers, to communicate with communities, with planning officers, with technical consultees, with politicians. Again, making sure that A, they can be engaged with the process and we can showcase that process with it appropriately, bearing in mind that urban design remains a really highly skilled and technical discipline. That's probably where I want to finish. Sorry, I hand to Mike.
Thanks, Bob. Much appreciated. Just for the people who are listening with their headphones, this is a different Irish person on the podcast. Um, I'm going to take us through the last part of the book, which is really focused on urban design futures. So, as urban designers, we fundamentally recognize that cities and places are not static, they're constantly changing. A core component of the book really was about focusing on how can we push toward more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient urban futures through responsive urban design. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about who can use this and how, but I'll start with who to begin with. So, one of the things that we're doing with the framework that has been presented to you is we're focusing on how to ensure we create places for people. And next slide there, please. And so, what we hope is that the final output of our process is a robust and contextually responsive place. That's the core goal. And one of the strengths of the framework as we've designed it is the diversity of purposes for which it can be used and by a range of different stakeholders. So to date, and as Phil mentioned at the outset of the podcast, we have engaged with lots of different types of stakeholders between urban design practitioners, other design and built environment professionals, between planning, engineering, and architecture, communities and local authorities. The process is a brilliant way of upskilling local people's knowledge of their places, and it gives them the evidence base to actually demand better quality and more robust solutions. And last but by no means least, design students and educators in the fields of urban design, planning, and architecture. We've seen some real successes in the way in which the framework is now being incorporated in lots of different programs in different contexts. The thing that we've done with the framework is about showcasing a distinct approach for how to practice and deliver urban design. And we unpack that conceptually, we unpack that practically. And in the book, we do that through the live case studies, as Bob mentioned. But it's also really important to mention that we have hundreds of best practice examples of what that looks like in different places all over the world. The next thing I'm going to mention then in terms of that urban design futuring is how it can be used. And so if we look at the framework, it's designed that it can be split into different parts. So the expectation isn't that the only way to have robust and responsive design is if you run the framework from start to finish. That's just not the case, and actually wouldn't represent what a lot of urban design practice and practitioners are doing. A townscape assessment, for example, is really stage one of the framework, setting out that context and how it is then situated around a particular site or series of sites. So we fully support the framework being split up into different parts. We have seen through a range of different engagements, as Phil mentioned at the outset, that can be very successful. So the analysis stage, that stage one, can be used as the evidence base to support a lot of decision making. We've seen it used to help support decision making for design codes, for strategic regeneration frameworks, for even development prospectus documents. So it can really support the delivery of planning, regeneration, and policy development. If it's coupled with the program, that yellow stage, stage two, that could be a robust route to the formulation of a full design code. So there are lots of different ways for the framework to be used and coupled together to create different distinct outputs. So if we look at the latter stages, the stages 3 and 4, those design stages, they really provide a robust template for collaboration between a range of different design and built environment professionals. So what we're able to say and what we're able to show is that the applied urban design framework is something that can support a wide range of people and a wide range of practices. The process itself as a full entity enables the delivery of a lot of different types of things in terms of continuous professional development, which we've done through a range of different professional institutes, as well as the delivery of education that promotes best practice in design, planning, and development. So it's extremely versatile in what it can achieve. It's important for us, though, I know I made a massive claim just there. It's also important for us to tone it down a bit. What we've done through the applied urban design framework is really create a foundation, a base to develop. It's important to highlight that we haven't managed to do everything. What we have focused on is really building that transferable, systematic, strategic methodology and evidencing how it can be applied in different places. But one of the things that we really want to request almost is that others plug in to the framework in terms of explorations of emerging areas and important areas in futuring urban design, whether that's in the expanse of urban informality across the globe, whether that's a focus on nature-based solutions. It might be about age-friendly cities or even child-friendly cities or smart solutions and AI-based design. It can really be anything. And we've had really great conversations with different entities in different parts of the UK around how that works. And we had one brilliant example in Cardiff where we talked about how kind of design technologies and particularly 3D modeling, VR, AR can really be an interesting way to explore how the framework can be applied in a slightly new direction. So we fundamentally understand that we haven't managed to do everything, but we support a lot of different types of exploration going forward to really just add more and more kind of context to our approach and our framework. Next. And I'll just pass back over to Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. So yeah, to kind of continue the story that I think Mick has kind of led us on to, after Bob walked us through the kind of framework that we've developed that we're using in our education, that students now who are practicing and have been for years and are moving into senior roles are still practicing and kind of hopefully seeing the value of in terms of the benefits in the real world in physical environments across the UK and further afield. We do want to start a conversation. We don't see this book, we don't see this podcast, we don't see this discussion that we're having as a full stop. We very much see it as a kind of open book. We're very much keen for people to critique the process, to plug in their research, their ideas, their own environments and contexts and settings, um, particularly when they are unique. I think Mick talked about some really interesting dynamics that we're seeing around the world in terms of future placemaking agendas. I think we've got a lot of post-conflict elements that are now coming online with the current situations around the world today, and the need for a flexible, usable, transferable process to allow for contextually responsive, people-centered, high-quality design solutions to come online. Is more prevalent and higher than ever before. And we really want to kind of allow the conversation to move from us, if you like, to you guys, to those who are listening, to those who are practicing, to those who have an interest in urban design in cities and placemaking, in how people use and engage with those. We're particularly, of course, interested in urban design as a technical discipline, the kind of practical side of that field. It's why we use the phrase applied urban design. We're not suggesting that we reframe the entire discipline of urban design. We would never be so bold or so daft, particularly in a setting such as the Urban Design Group's podcast. We see great value, and I think we've hopefully demonstrated that today in all of those different considerations and perspectives that people bring to urban design, those different backgrounds, those different mindsets, those different cultures and contexts. But what we do want to focus on is reframing the idea of urban design as a practical field, as a discipline of the urban designer. And we want to kind of start conversations around a couple of areas. One of the areas is around education. It's kind of where much of our work happens and much of our research is going on. But I think most urban design educators around the world, even in just the UK context, would agree that there is a lack of clarity across urban design programs. I know it's something that the Urban Design Group themselves have talked about at length over the last 5, 10, 15 years, the idea of what is an urban design master's program or taught program. Often they're standalone, like they may be in a place like Manchester or particularly maybe somewhere like Sheffield as well. But often there are sub-specialisms in other places where they sit as a kind of specialized version of an architecture degree or a planning degree or even a landscape or broader urban studies or urbanism degree. And again, perhaps there's value in that, but we are really keen to think about what do we teach? What do other people teach? What are the core skills? What are the knowledge that we see as valuable to urban designers who go beyond out of education into practicing in the real world again? What's required then of that urban designer? What skills do they need to kind of have to be able to make positive difference and a positive influence on our cities and urban environments? Very much some of the focus that we've talked about today are on traditional design skills. They're on the idea of being able to develop around some of those functional blueprints that Bob kind of introduced and those kind of core livable principles and how you deliver those in a technical manner. To be able to do that, we require skills in software, we require mechanical, technical, applied skills that certain other disciplines may well have as a core fundamental component of their education system that maybe urban design, still in its infancy, is still growing and learning and developing. We're really interested in what are those skills, but critically, how do we educate and how do we use those in practice? Again, the idea of application of a process, again, something we're trying to engender conversation around with what we've kind of done here and what we're publishing. And finally, experience. Again, what are the roles that urban designers undertake in practice? I mean, these again are not really well defined. They're often vague, they're often misunderstood. How do we evidence the need for an urban designer in cities? How do we see the benefit of having urban designers with the right education, the right skills, and the right knowledge to make those positive differences? What are the qualities that an urban design educated person, an urban design practitioner is bringing to places? One of the fundamental problems, I think, today in the UK and further afield is that idea of the urban designer being cut out of the development process, of the design process, because of the kind of lack of understanding of the value that they're bringing. And I think having these conversations and reframing design in this way can only help us kind of elevate that role and ensure that more and more projects moving forward demand that an urban designer is being brought in and kind of adding that value to those projects. So this idea then that we want to leave you with and we really want to kind of hear some feedback on is this idea of the urban design practitioner, a technical discipline that's certainly at this point in time difficult to unravel. It is a vague role and title which is used broadly without real protection, without real understanding of what it exactly means. And I think that does reflect a lot of what we've talked about at the very beginning, the kind of magpie characterization of urban design as a field. What is it? What does it do? What do we know? What should we know? What should we be delivering? And how should we be doing that? And it also reflects a little bit about that diversity of education we've just mentioned, this notion of programs within programs, of not having that kind of set standard. I think the Urban Design Group are doing some fantastic work on helping us shape and understand what urban design looks like and what urban designers might do. And we hope that our work here is just a little piece of that puzzle, which can help within pedagogy, help within practice, but also critically help start new conversations, new research agendas as we try to grow this discipline that we're all invested in, that we all are passionate about, and we all see value. We're aware in an Urban Design Group podcast, we're kind of preaching to the converted. We've got a room full of converts in many ways. Some of you might have different ideas on how we're doing it, but I think everyone would encourage these types of conversations. So we hope to see more of that going forward. We would love to collaborate with people, even if it's just to hear your critique, your negative critiques, your positive critiques. Any kind of conversation that we start on this is really welcome, and we hope to have future events that we're able to have more face-to-face discussions where we can see this move forward over the next 5, 10 plus years. The importance of place, the importance of cities for people is just growing as more and more people kind of live within these urban environments. As cars have taken predominance over these urban environments, as we've seen an increase in the need for rebuilding of cities and places, as we're seeing more and more studies show the impact environmentally, socially, on health, on children, on older people of poor environments, the need for urban design for higher quality, people-centered places that speak of that location, of that climate, of that context, of that culture is more necessary than ever. With that, I think we will end. We want to say a big thank you to the Urban Design Group, of course, for inviting us to do this. And we'd like to say a big thank you to anyone who's listened and managed to get through the entire podcast. We're not sure how long this has went on for. If you've made it to the end, congratulations, well done. If you are interested in the book, You can obviously reach out to myself, to Mick, to Bob, and you can chat about it with us. You can obviously find the book online if it is something you're keen on. And we'd certainly be interested if you have read the book or you purchased the book and have a look at it as to what your thoughts are. And we always want that feedback because, again, for us, it's not a full stop. This is just the beginning of something that we hope to develop over a long period of time in our own collaborations, but also working outside with practice, local authorities, and other educators. So, yeah, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, folks. Thank you for listening.
Cheers.